Today I am going to show you how to connect GitHub Actions with your AWS account and avoid having to store any secrets either from GitHub or from AWS. Currently you see the completed workflow that I have set up that assumes a role in AWS account and uploads a file to an S3 bucket. So as you can see, it used to be empty before the workflow ran, and now if I refresh, it does have index.html in it. So let's see how we set it up. First, let me guide you through the workflow itself. I created this branch in my The Game repository, and it's literally the game. There is a board game with numbers. Go look it up. And here in .github/workflows folder, I have this section called deploy to s3.yaml. And what does it do? First of all, we define the environment variables, which are the bucket name and AWS region. You could obviously store them as actual environment variables in GitHub, but for now we just have them here. Then these two things are required for basically requesting the tokens from AWS. And then we have the actual logic for the action. So here we give it the name, we say whatever it runs on, and then it just common stuff that we may need, like checking out a Git repository. And then the most important part here, or two most important parts, are configure AWS credentials step, which here we only really need 3 parameters to get it working. One of which is the role to assume, and that's actually the role ARN. Then role session name, which literally could be anything, but for some reason it's required when you're assuming a role. And then AWS region, which may or may not be required depending on the resource you're trying to access. And I'm pretty sure it's actually not required in our case, because both the roles and S3 buckets are global, so maybe try it without one and see if it still works. And then we have another step that actually does the work. It copies index.html to S3, and that's it. Why may you want to do such a thing? One example I can come up with is that if you serve your static website from Amazon S3, then you don't want to always copy all the files manually. You just want to set up probably a GitHub action if your repository is in GitHub and just have it automatically do that anytime you make a code change. So this is what the action looks like. Now, what do we do? In fact, there's nothing we need to do in GitHub anymore. Literally, we just have to have the action where we have provided which role we need to assume, and that's basically it. The actual magic happens in the AWS account, so let's go and take a look there. First of all, obviously, you have the bucket itself. So if you don't have one, create one and update your GitHub action with the bucket name. For now, I'm going to delete this file so we could retest it after we make the changes. Now let's clone this page or duplicate it and go to IAM. In the last video, I basically went through what each of these access management things means, and we briefly mentioned identity providers. Today, that's actually what we need. So we click on the identity providers and we see that there is none of them right now. What we do is click on Add Provider, and then we have a couple of options. So with GitHub, if you go and read GitHub documentation, you need to use OpenID Connect and paste the link and the audience. So the link for that is token.actions.githubusercontent.com, and the audience is sts.amazonaws.com. And then feel free to add tags. We are not going to do that. We just click Add Provider, but we are not done yet. What we need to do is go to this provider, and then we need to assign a role. So how does this work? We create this identity provider that GitHub is, and then we basically will let it assume a role in our AWS account so it could perform some actions on the resources that we allow it to perform the actions on. So we click on here, click assign role, and then you can use an existing role if you already have one, but we are going to create a new one. And actually it helps you fill everything out here. We pick the only audience we have, then our GitHub organization is my username, and then the GitHub repository is the game, and branch is test actions AWS. Okay, now we click next, and then it asks us if we want to add any permissions. We are actually going to skip this because we want to create a custom permissions policy. So we click next. Here, as I said, it already filled everything out for us that we needed. Here it asks us for the role name, and what we can do is go to our workflow and see what we have here. It's called GitHub S3 Access. Obviously, feel free to change it to whatever. Feel free to fill out the description so you don't forget what the heck it's for. And then we click Create Role. So now we search for this role, and as you can see, currently it has no policies. So we're going to, let's say, create an inline policy. And then we can choose what service we want this role to perform on. So in our case, it's gonna be S3, and we don't want all the actions. What we want is actually put object, and put object basically means upload the file. And here we can either say that we allow this role to upload anything or any objects to any of the buckets in our account, or we can add ARNs to restrict access, which is better. So here we can say any object name, because we don't want to limit the names of the files we want to upload. We only want to limit which buckets they will be uploaded to. And then here we just go and copy the bucket name, and it automatically populated the resource ARN for us. Click Add ARNs, click Next, click Create Policy after we give it the policy name, S3. Let's just say this. Obviously make it more descriptive so you remember what the heck it's for. And then we click Create Policy. So what we have now is this GitHub S3 Access IAM role, which has a policy which allows whoever assumes this role to upload any objects to the bucket name GitHub AWS creds S3 upload test. And then in the trust relationships, we see who can actually assume this role. And in our case is the federated GitHub provider, and basically only the actions that are performed on the repository under my organization, under the game repository, under test actions AWS branch, will be allowed to assume this role. Now, when we go back to our actions, we should be able to just rerun it and see that the file still gets uploaded to the S3 bucket. And if it didn't, then most likely I missed something, and we will figure it out. And the workflow has completed. So if we go and refresh this bucket again, we do see that index.html file is in it. And that is basically it. This is how you connect GitHub Actions with your AWS account without using any stored credentials. As you could see, we did not have to generate any access keys, any secrets, any API keys, whatever. We just set up an identity provider, we set up a role, we set up a trust policy, and we set up new permissions, and now it just works. And if you want to learn more about IAM in general, what all of these things mean, then go watch my last video where I explain all of that there. See you in the next one.